Good day, YouTubers. It's clouding up, and but it's still a sunny day in my heart for all of you out there. So you want some more stories? Let's see. I've been talking to you folks about how things are and telling you that you have to think with your heart and feel with your head. And you go, Sensei, what does that mean? That means everything that comes across your sensory grid, you have to feel. You don't process it through your noggin, because your brain is not who you are. Your brain is just your hard drive. Your heart is your CPU. And this is something I learned from the day I was born. Because around me, I was very blessed because I did not have the normal family traumas. Not the fact that they weren't. My father was a triple Virgo and Air Force, do this, do that, screaming orders. My brothers and sisters didn't realize that all you had to do was say, yes, sir, right away, sir, and then go up and do whatever the heck you wanted because he never checked up on anything. And my mom was a triple Capricorn. She ruled, and ruling is not like administrating. It's like off with your head. So you never quite crossed her, ever. And here's a little story about the only time I ever crossed my mother. And it wasn't really my fault. I was experimenting, as I often did as a youngster. I had a friend whose father was a real scientist, worked for Sperry Rand, and we used to go, and he was working on the UNIVAC. And we would go there with him, and he had Scientific Americas, and because he was also working sideways for Grumman Aerospace, he had this great magazine called Space Digest, and it was everything ever done in space. Every satellite, every rocket, every engine, every valve. There was an article in that thing. It was like Aviation and Space Weekly, but it was just space, right? He also got Aviation and Space Weekly. And all these were magazines, they were journals. And you just didn't pick them up at the newsstand. You had to have like almost a clearance because Aviation and Space, you didn't need to have the CIA or the KGB or Schmersh. They published everything that they did. What was really interesting, Mr. Tesla, who has his rockets, Elon Musk, those rockets were actually done in the 70s, meaning Lockheed, Skunk Works, Boeing, and Grumman Aerospace, before they became Lockheed Martin and Grumman, whoever they are now. But anyway, all of those guys got together and developed rockets that once they launched their payload, they came back and landed on tripods. Didn't float down into the water and got picked up, but actually did that, and actually did that a great deal. And there was a unmanned shuttle that still, I think it's the X-35, and that sucker's been around in some version forever. And it can, heft loads the size of a school bus into upper Earth orbit, where they like to put, birds that stay up there, birds of prey. And so I had exposure to all of this when I was, between the ages of 5 and when did I start seminary? 13. And the Scientific Americas in the back, I don't know if they still have it, had a thing called the Young Scientist. And they had experiments, every, step of the way how to do it. And some pretty, like a vacuum chamber. And a vacuum chamber is like one step below a cyclotron. It's a high voltage environment in a vacuum that you create an ether. This is kind of interesting stuff. And there were articles in there on how to build your own Tesla coil. And we built Tesla coils, not little things, but gigantic things, 10 foot high, like the size that Tesla made. We just took the equations that were in Scientific America and kind of ramped it up. And I had another friend whose father worked for Bell Labs, and the stuff they would throw out was mind-boggling. So we would, rummage through their garbage pit, and we would also, there was a place in Lower Manhattan, which was the site of where the World Trade Center was built, and that was called Radio Row. And in the 60s, we would go in there and get things, and they had stuff that was like from Tesla's time, and they had scalar amplifiers, which were quite very interesting, because most amplifiers or transformers work on the Hertzian, XY, amplitude and modulation. And scalar, instead of having a two-dimensional parameter, it had 16 dimensions. So we were playing around with that stuff from age 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. And so I had this little experiment out in front of the garage that I was trying to do. And it was an etheric field that I was on another dimension creating glycerin, what's that stuff called? Mercurochrome and there's another substance. But anyway, they made crystals. And those crystals were very interesting. This is like long before people were using crystals in electronics. And I was trying to create these etheric crystals to be a transformer, right? So I was fooling around with it, and you had to keep it, in some pretty exotic states. One, very cold, so I had dry ice. And two, I had a vacuum changer. So I had this like glass globe that I got out of the garbage pit at, Bell Labs. And it had these great little ports that you could put wires into, and still it would hold the vacuum. Anyway, so I'm doing this, and it's summertime, and I'm wearing a pair of shorts and a t-shirt and flip-flops, and I was probably all of 10. And so I had it, 30 feet from the house and 30 feet from where the driveway ended and the swimming pool began. And I'm, trying to make this thing work. And so there are a lot of variables. And it's summer and it's hot and I'm sweating and it's getting in my eyes. And I finally realized what this is. When I was in first grade, a nun beat the ever-living you-know-what out of me and broke my orbit and my jaw. Just because I upset her, because it was during the missile crisis, and I wouldn't get under the desk because I told her that we were right in ground zero, and we would be hit with a hydrogen bomb, and we would be atomized, so no getting under the desk would protect us. And somehow I must have unleashed some deadly fear she had of that, and she nearly killed me. I have a tendency, of running into dogmatic folk who somehow I push their buttons to the point where they want to kill me. And I've learned not to do that anymore, right? So back to my little experiment. And I was, doing this, and it was like July. And so I was, tweaking all the parameters. And just as my mother drove into the driveway, I lost containment. And the etheric environment expanded very rapidly. And then, because it was changing states very rapidly, it exploded. And it enveloped me in a gigantic hydrogen ball of explosion, flame, but I mean beyond flame. It was like a sun. And my mother drove in, and as she's driving in, she sees me, woof, be surrounded by this sun, and it freaked her out so much, she turned the wheel, instead of running me over, she turned the wheel and went into the swimming pool. She drove her favorite Cadillac into the swimming pool. And luckily for both of us, she drove into the shallow end. And her car was like that, and the water was like up to her chest, and I had to, I was on fire, so I ran and jumped into the swimming pool to put myself out, and it had burned all my clothes off, and I had it burned all my hair off, my head, my eyebrows, my eyelashes, all the hair on my body, and that's kind of one reason why I have these very weird eyebrows, because after that they kind of grew in this way. And I was like a 10-year-old Red Lobster Yul Brynner. So I made my way over to the car and opened the door and got my mother out, and she was wearing a very beautiful dress, and she had her hair. My mom always looked like a queen, and even as she's going to the supermarket, right? And so I get her out of the car, and that scene where in The Simpsons, Homer is trying to strangle Bart. He's got his hands around Bart's little neck, and Bart's tongue is like, Well, that was my mom. She was actually trying to kill me, strangle me to death. And she was going, I'll kill you, I'll kill you, I'll kill you, because she was upset. Not, honey, are you okay? Oh my God, we have to go to the hospital. You're a red lobster, a Yul Brynner red lobster. But no, I'll kill you, I'll kill you, I'll kill you. And this was right around the time the TV show Kung Fu was. So I kept watching how, the Kung Fu guy could break someone by just taking his two arms and pushing them quickly between the other person's arms and breaking that stranglehold, which I did to my mom. And then I ran away naked. And she was running after me, wet as a rat. Her long, beautiful hair was like drenched. Her long dress was like clinging to her very curvy body. And she's screaming, I'll kill you! I'll kill you! I'll kill you! Right? And she's chasing me around the neighborhood. And the neighbors, it's summer afternoon, and the neighbors are sitting out on the porch, and they're watching me naked, red as a lobster, bald as Yul Brynner, and my mother chasing me, sopping wet, screaming, I'll kill you! I'll kill you! And luckily for me, my mother was smoking at the time about 2 packs of cigarettes. So she got about 12 feet and then she'd start running, I'll kill you! And she made it around the block about 4 times before she kind of just gave up and went in the house. And Mrs. Weiner came over and got me and brought me into her house. And she too was a nurse. And she lathered me up in Noxzema. I mean, I was lathered from top to tail. And she put, Teddy was her son and my good friend. And Teddy I met, we went to first grade together. And we were both outsiders. And Teddy always walked on his tiptoes. And Jimmy, his brother, was blind as a bat. He had glasses like that thick, he was like unbelievably blind. And he actually had a cane. And we would walk to school to Holy Redeemer, right, about 20 blocks. And we would always go in, we walked right by City Hall, and we'd go into the judge's bathroom, all marble and everything. And they had hot towels, and and we'd always, in the morning, we'd wash up and get all refreshed and go off to school, to a terrible Catholic school, where in first grade the nun nearly killed me. And I only went to that school for, 3 or 4 months before the nun tried to kill me. And then I ended up back in kindergarten with Miss Girling, who I loved dearly. And she nursed me back to health, and my grandmother and other of my grandmother's friends took care of me. Anyway, so Mrs. Weiner kind of lathered me up in Noxzema. I put on some of Teddy's clothes, and I went back home. And my father was there, right? And he looked at me all lathered up in Noxzema. I kind of looked like the reverse of a blackface. And he said, Albert, come here. And I said, yes, Dad. He goes, are you okay? I said, yeah, I think so. And he goes, I said, Mrs. Weiner kind of took care of me, and she said, it's just like a severe case of sunburn. And he goes, what were you doing? And I tried to explain it to my father, and my dad says, okay. He goes, your mother wants me to kill you, but I can't do that. So what I'm going to do is we're going to go over to the air intake of the air conditioning. And I'm going to take off my belt, and I want you to scream, no, not the belt, not the belt. And I'm going to whack the air intake really loud, and you scream like I'm, whipping you, okay? Okay. So my dad does that, and we go through that little thing. And my father has dragged my mattress out to the garage. And my father says, your mother wants you to sleep in the garage. I said, for how long? And she said, forever. And that's where my dog, Dandy, slept. And so, I curled up in my thing, and Dandy curled up in my arms, and it wasn't so bad. It was summertime, and so it was actually, we had the garage door open and the side door open, so there was a nice little breeze, and it was actually not so bad. Anyway, after about 2 or 3 weeks, and I had to eat out there. I didn't get to eat with the family. I had to eat out there. And my lab, they locked up my lab. I couldn't do any more experiments. And so my mother, after about 3 weeks, one nice, June day, she comes out with a plate of cookies. And I've healed by this time. I've gone past the blister point. And Mrs. Weiner kept lathering me up in Noxzema. And so my mother said to me, never do that again, and we'll not ever talk of it. Have a cookie. So I had a cookie, and all was back to semi-normal. And from that moment on, my mother loved flowers. And every day I would walk home from school, and Mrs. McGrath had a beautiful garden, And I asked her if I could pick a few flowers. And she, once we did it together. And then I told her why I needed them, because my mother loved them, and otherwise she'd kill me. I had to do something nice for my mother. So Mrs. McGrath would have a basket of flowers on her fence post. And as I walked back from school, from Mrs. Girling's, I would bring that in to my mother. And she would snip off the ends and put them in vases, and that's what made my mom happy. So pretty much the rest of my life, I brought my mother flowers. And pretty much that put me in good stead with my mom. The other thing was my mom was a writer and a reader, and so was I. And so we had a very good connection, almost a salon between us, of writing and reading each other's stuff. And no one knew that my mother read as much as she did and wrote as much as she did. But I did, because I read her stuff, and she read mine. And that was a special connection, that the flowers, reading and writing. And we used to read stories together out loud, right? And we used to read really funny things like, what was that story about the little mouse who the family adopted, and he had his own little car, and he'd always get in adventures. Anyway, and Travels with Charlie, and we read a lot of books together. Even when I got older, we would read them out loud together. And it was a great pleasure, and something and when my mother got sick in her 90s, I used to read to her, and she really liked that. Anyway, these were special things that I had with my mom. And I had other things with my dad. We could kind of goof around. My dad liked to be goofy, but he didn't do it around anybody but me. So those were the two things I had with my parents that were special, where my brothers and sisters did not have, because they were going through the teenage, I hate them, oh, they're so terrible. Not really. All you had to do was make them laugh, say that you were going to do what they told you to do, and then go off and do whatever the heck you wanted to do, because they would never check. I was the youngest. They never checked up on me. I went back to doing experiments, within months. And I basically moved my stuff over to my grandma's house. And that's why I didn't have the normal traumas. I didn't have the bad feelings that kept on. My brothers and sisters still have issues with my parents, and they're dead. I mean, I took care of my mom and dad for 28 years. When I came back from Ireland in 1980, and they were in their late 70s, and I was in my 30s, my brothers and sisters wouldn't. Right? They wanted to kill my parents, because my brothers and sisters worked for my parents. I never did. So they had issues. I didn't. But I wanted to take care of my parents because I wanted to have the experience that I had when I was younger and have it complete. So when they died, I'd have no issues. I mean, I was going to tell them everything I felt, everything I experienced, wanted to know everything about them, and I did do that. Now, my parents lived another 28 years from 1980. Now, my mom died at 103 and my dad 98, and I took care of them all those years. But it wasn't a drudge, because I kind of said, listen, when you guys are good, you're fun. I love being with you. When you're jerks, I won't be with you, period. I'm not going to whine and argue. I just won't be here. I does, but what if I fall down the staircase? I said, well, you better be a nice guy when you do that, because I won't come and see you unless you are. Anyway, so it worked out quite nice. Yeah, there were moments, and, but they were important. See, everything happens to me for a reason. It helps me learn. So if you go read my X-rated blogspot.com and you read the first cut, you'll have a good sense of my parents, other than what I just said. Well, we're pushing on to 25 minutes, So I'm going to stop right then and there.